Good evening and welcome to the History of Surveying, presented by Farber Surveying. Over the next half hour, we'll be getting a history lesson on a subject that maybe on the surface doesn't seem that interesting, but trust me, over the next half hour, you'll be intrigued by what you're going to see and what you're going to hear. So the history of surveying, and that's what we'll be talking about over the next half hour. And giving us that history lesson is Herb Farber, the owner, and you run Farber Surveying. Thanks for being here, Herb.
It's a pleasure.
Right.
It's going to be fun going through this.
Yeah, we've got a PowerPoint to go through and pictures and information, but before we get there, a little bit of history on you. How long have you been here, and how the heck did you get into surveying?
Well, it's like many of us in various professions. What we started off doing wasn't where we ended up. Yeah. So I graduated from Washington State University with a degree in forestry and business, and was working in the logging industry up in the Canyonville, Tiller, Umpqua, South Umpqua area. And I hurt myself, had an injury, and I couldn't continue to work in the logging industry. And a friend of mine was a surveyor down here in Medford, and so I went to work for him part-time. And eventually I got my license, and then I bought a business from him and now own that business. And that was back in 1987 that I purchased the business, and it became Farber Surveying.
So going on 25 years then.
Yes.
On doing it. What do you enjoy most about it?
The most interesting thing about surveying is that we're dealing with the history of the land. We're historians. We're following in the footsteps of our previous surveyors that we're going to talk about here with the PowerPoint. And it's never the same. It's not like working in a factory where you have X problem and you have to solve it. The problems are unique and with every piece of land, and it's challenging and it's rewarding being able to solve people's problems.
All right, so just off the top, a thought is, hasn't the land already been surveyed at one point? So where's the need for future surveying?
Well, some of the lands have been surveyed. The underlying lands have all been surveyed, but individual parcels for many years were deeded out by written document only, and they weren't surveyed. And oftentimes there's conflicts between those deed documents on how well they were written and how well it is that we can go out and retrace them. So, and then plus people don't pay attention to where the surveyed lines are sometimes, and they build things in the wrong place or put fences where they're not supposed to be. So there's always something happening in the property world that requires further revision and surveying.
Very good. All right, well let's go to the chalkboard and start the history lesson.
All right. Okay, the history of Oregon surveying. And to look at this, we'll start off with modern surveying. The science of surveying and mapping is determining the positions above, on, or below, under the surface of the earth, and they're typically attached to written documents that describe those positions. And then today's physical aspects of surveying and boundary law, and as applied by written document to the site. And today's modern instruments make it a whole lot different than the early day surveyors, because we've got GPS and current instrumentation that makes our life a lot easier. And accompanying those instruments are computers. And so computers have made it a lot more efficient. And with that efficiency, it comes a lot less error, because a lot of the error was made from writing notes down, angles and distances, then transcribing them into computed coordinates, and then mapping them. Well, now it's all done by computer. So we have a computer we carry around in the field with us, and then the computer is plugged into the office computer, and then we generate our maps and computations. So a lot of that error went away with that.
Where would we be
process.
Without computers, right?
Right, we'd probably be without a lot less paper. They have a tendency to generate a great deal of paper. And so a professional land surveyor is qualified by education and experience, and then with every state that surveyors work in, there's a registration process that is done by examination, and it's controlled by what are the laws of that state that the particular surveyor may be working in. So going back in time, the PLS system, the Public Land Survey system, came about after the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War, at which time the government didn't have the ability to tax folks. Today's taxation is nothing like it was when our country started, because there was virtually no way to tax people to generate income for our government. So they saw the sale of land in the Western Territories an ability to pay off that debt. And so they established two goals after the Declaration of Independence. And one goal was a reward and a payment for the service that our soldiers did for us in the Revolutionary War. And so they were promised land, so we had to have a way to convey the land to them. And then to sell the lands to generate money to pay for the debt. So the lands needed to be surveyed.
And created jobs.
And it created jobs for some folks.
Yeah.
One of the first surveyors, and one of our third president, I believe, was Thomas Jefferson, and he proposed the land survey, rectangular survey system. And in 1785, the land ordinance was passed that created the rectangular system, but it hadn't been implemented yet. So the whole purpose of the rectangular system was to provide an efficient way to sell land and have it available as a commodity to help fund the government and to get it from public domain into the private domain. So the ordinance of Northwest Ordinance of 1787, I have a tough time with 18s and 17s, but in 1787, the Northwest Territories were created, and that was the first implementation of the rectangular survey system. So with that implementation, the Northwest Territories, for those that aren't aware, were all the lands east of the Mississippi, north of the Ohio River, and south of up to the Great Lakes. And
it was captured quite well there on a previous slide as it showed the delineation.
Right.
And certainly looking at this slide right here, that map looks a whole heck of a lot different than it certainly does today in where the territories
absolutely. There's
are divided.
5 states there now than where it was when the territory was established. And so the purpose of the rectangular system was to get the land in a state that it can be conveyed to the one for the soldiers in the return for their service, and then to pay the debt. So this was a big change from the original 13 colonies, because it was still using pretty much an English system when they came over here, and it was going from rocks to trees and roads and to this ridge line and whatever. And it's a more complex system, and it creates a lot of disputes and ambiguities.
Do you have any idea what meets and bounds are and what that means?
It's just the written direction and courses in describing a land. So it's a meets and bounds would be north 20 degrees west to a rock, and then north 40 degrees west to a tree. And so that's the meets and the bounds of a piece of property.
And if that tree got cut down or struck down by lightning, or the rock got moved,
then it creates a lot of controversy.
Okay.
That's part of the ambiguities that were created with the original system. And that system is still in use today in the original 13 states.
Is it so that it's not rectangular in that piece?
No, it's still the meets and bounds survey system. The rest of the country is all done with the PLSS system. And to this date, there's over 1.5 billion acres that have been surveyed in that. And that's how all the lands have been conveyed in the rest of the lands of the United States. And it's carried also to Alaska. I don't think Hawaii has so much, but I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
So all the lands are broken up into townships, which are 6 miles on a side. And then within each township, there are 36 sections, which are 1 mile square. and containing 640 acres.
And looking at this slide right there, so that obviously shows you the rectangular system and exactly how the township and the range. Forgive me, I saw this slide before and I saw all those numbers. The numbers inside the box make sense to me. Can I ask the exterior numbers?
The exterior numbers are just the same townships bordering it.
Got it. Okay. Got it.
And
okay.
so if you step
That's
to
the
each
adjacent-
side, it's a
yeah.
restart of another
That's the
township
adjacent
or the
township.
finishing of a township.
Very good. Okay.
Now, on each of the section corners, there was a permanent marker set, and in the quarter corners, there was also monuments set. So in the quarter corners are the half-mile points between each section corner. So you go in the survey process as you're going through it. Now, the markers for these corners, because these guys were in the wilderness to a certain extent, and so there wasn't a Home Depot or a Lowe's to go get corner monuments from. So they had to use whatever materials they had available to mark the corners. So they would use posts and rocks and stones, and then they were witnessed by trees and various other things. And sometimes it's pits and mounds. They dig a pit and put some mounds out to mark a corner.
Are those corners still marked? Obviously, they're still marked. Or
some of them today are still marked the same way they were
Yeah.
when they were originally surveyed, but many of them have been upgraded and restored, and some have been lost over time.
is there a standard way now of marking? So if you were to go survey something, we do have Lowe's and Home Depots now.
There are some basic standards in the laws, and depending on what state you might be surveying, and they have different requirements for different types of monumentation. So that has become standardized somewhat, but there are always situations where the standard doesn't apply, and we have to be creative still on what we do to mark a corner. If a corner that we come to has got a fire hydrant on it, obviously we can't move
Yeah.
the fire hydrant. So there's obstructions at times that we have to work around.
All right, and just to dig in a little bit deeper on it too. So in the mountainous terrains, you're going to come across a corner perhaps that is very difficult to get to one way or another. That is some of what the surveyors did go through. I'm not talking right now you run into that problem, but back when the entire country and the Western Territories were being surveyed.
It created challenges.
Yeah.
And so as the surveyors went about their jobs, they had to challenge all of those things, raging rivers, wild Indians, and all of these things in the process of conducting their surveys. So as the country grew, though, the survey moved west, and as it moved west, the Oregon Territory was established in 1848. And when that became a territory, all of the land claims up to that point in time were nullified. And a part of that reason was because Hudson Bay and the English were some of the people that were here, and because they're not citizens of the United States, they nullified their ownership. I think a lot of them got it back through the same process that other citizens that came to the country, or the territories, got their lands.
They just had to reestablish.
Right, they had to reestablish it and go through the process defined by the United States government and the territory. Yeah. And so in 1850, the Donation Land Act was passed by Congress, and what it was intended to do is encourage settlement of the Oregon Territory. So when the settlers came out here after 1850, a single man could get 320 acres, while a married man could get 640 acres. And the women were able to retain their claims to these properties if their husband died, but the women couldn't come out and get their own own land at that point in time. So in order for the people who made these claims to acquire their land, it had to be surveyed, because they couldn't get a title to it, and the government couldn't deed them the land without something to reference it to. So the first thing that was done in the Oregon Territories, there's a surveyor general appointed, and our first surveyor general was John B. Preston. And the lands and the settlers that came here before 1850 or 1851, when the surveys started in Oregon, were instructed to claim their lands and try to keep them as much north and south as practical, but they really didn't have anything to tie them to. So they just mark out their 320 acres or 640 acres and start claiming it and proving up on it, because by just living on it and making it a productive land, they could own it. There was no fee or anything. It just, they had to make it work and then prove up on the lands. So the land needed to be surveyed. So the initial point for Oregon survey was established in 1851. And that first survey marker was established by John Preston, James Freeman, and William Ives, and it's called the Willamette Stone today, and it's now currently a brass cap. This is a photograph of the actual monument. And this was in the West Hills of Portland.
And that's still there if we were
Yes.
to track it down? How difficult is it to get to that spot?
It's actually in a park in West Portland, and there's a little trail down to it. It's not difficult at all to get to.
Okay, okay.
So that was the initial point of all of our surveys, and all of the descriptions and property ownership in Oregon and Washington originates from that point.
Huh.
So as we go through the process, the instructions from the Surveyor General was to establish baselines and a meridian for which to base all the townships off of, such that it wouldn't hit the Columbia River and it would be relatively easy to survey, and also take care of the populated areas. So the Willamette baseline is the east-west line that controls all of the survey grid, and it runs from the Pacific Ocean to the Snake River. And then the Willamette Meridian is the north-south segment of the survey basis, and it runs from the California border all the way up to Canada, and some of it running through Puget Sound. So this established the grid that the surveyors can measure their townships off of and then into sections as they further refine their survey. Now, their instructions, if we think back to the slide of the township, the instructions for their survey was to start on the south boundary of the township, go north a mile, east a mile, go back and to where they started going east, and then go north and east until they got to the top of the township. And then they were instructed to come all the way back south and repeat that process from the south boundary for the next tier until they finished the township. Well, the fact that they were paid by the mile, they weren't about to spend 6 miles doing nothing.
Yeah.
So they figured out ways that they could conduct a survey as efficiently as they could, and then they'd go back and write up their notes later, and so that it looked like they surveyed the way they were instructed to. So when you read the original notes that are now of record, they surveyed per instructions, but in the field, in a practical application, they didn't really do that.
So no one going back and checking their work, right? Any good manager, any good leader who sets a crew out to do something, you've got to check up on them. It almost sounds like, that go out there and
the Surveyor General did have, part of his task was to go and do field inspections.
Uh-huh.
But I think it was pretty hit and miss.
Yeah.
It wasn't really all that detailed. And they actually did do the survey work for the most part, but they just didn't follow the exact steps that they were supposed to. And some of the surveys were better than others. Now, as they surveyed the meridian down from Portland, the foothills, and Willamette Stone, they used the Gunther chain, which is 66 feet in length, and it has 100 links in it that are 0.66 feet each. And they used 2 sets of change when they were doing the meridian so that they didn't have too much error creep into their survey, because every survey has some error to it.
So they'd put chains side by side to make sure they're accurate?
I think that they measured not necessarily in tandem, but more or less side by side, or a few chains ahead or back, and then they'd check in at every half mile to compare their notes.
Okay, sure.
To make sure that they were consistent.
But that seems, yeah, let's see if we can find the heaviest material possible to use our measuring with.
It had to be durable and something that they could pull and stretch out without breaking it, and so it had to be pretty sturdy.
Yeah, very good point.
And then they used a solar compass, which was originally designed in the 1830s by William Burt when he was surveying in Michigan and Minnesota in the iron fields, where all the surveys up to that point in time were just done with a compass, a good compass, a staff compass that they could sight through and run good lines with. But in the iron fields, the compass would go in circles. I mean, it just wouldn't function. So he designed this survey, the solar compass, which allows them to take solar shots that help define and keep them on true northeast-west headings, which is what the townships needed. Then the axeman on the crews would mark trees and mark the line and references the corners. And the chainmen were dragging this heavy chain. Now, in the practical world, they use the chain as a standard, but frequently they made copies of the chain with whatever material was sturdy enough that they can use to make distance measurements with, because you can imagine how difficult it was dragging that chain through the woods. I mean, it was a lot of work.
Yeah.
And they were getting paid by the mile.
A lot of miles to be...
So they found a way to do it as efficiently and as accurate as they could, and so they could make money doing it.
Using rope and using whatever?
Rope or probably ropes for the most part.
Yeah.
I can't imagine anything else being durable enough to do that with. So the surveyors kept detailed notes of all their observations, including the direction that they were going, which in going north was typically always cardinal until they closed in on the opposite side of the township. And then there might be a variation there. And then they also made notes of what the lands consisted of as they traveled over them. So the soil types, the vegetation. They came to a creek, they called for it. If there was an existing road, they surveyed across, they called for the road. If they came across a settler's house and it was within view, they'd say that the house was exchanged east or from that point that they were along the mile section line. So these notes were then handed off to a cartographer that would take and transcribe them into official notes, which you see copies of on the slide. And that's the official record that we still use today.
Really? You go back and refer to
at
if
times,
needed?
At times we do, yes.
Huh.
And so they would take these field books that they use to actually do the survey work, transcribe them into this and to make maps. And once the maps were prepared and everything else, they would dispose of those field books. They were destroyed so that there weren't any potential conflicts with what they called as the original notes, which were transcribed.
All right, knowing the room for error, and if you ever have a need to go refer to those notes, how confident can you feel that it's accurate?
Some of them were very good and some you watch for.
Yeah.
And you learn the traits of the various surveyors as you move along and you retrace them. And personal knowledge and learning from other surveyors that have that knowledge is part of what it takes to be a good surveyor. So after this first round of surveys that were done, which we're going to talk about still some more, but they concentrated on areas that were already inhabited and already being used for agriculture and settlement. And the later lands were then filled in later. Well, this corner is a section corner that I recovered in 1984 that was established in 1884 by Rufus Moore. So I found it 100 years later, and it's on Range 4 East from here on. That's also the Jackson-Klamath County line. And so it was 3 miles north of the township line, and there's 3 lines scribed on that rock. It's a little bit difficult to see, but it says that it was 3 miles north of the township line. And the references were used for me to find this. And I also found a quarter corner that has a 1/4 S scribed on it. You can't see it in the photo, but it is on that side of that rock. And it was pretty plain to see once you find the rock and look at it closely.
So those have been there for at least when you found it,
100 years.
Yeah,
Yes.
and certainly now 125 or what have you.
And then each corner has references to it, and they're usually bearing trees. And if there weren't trees available and you're in difficult areas, they marked rocks and various other things as bearing objects. And the purpose of these references is if the cornerstone was, or the corner, whatever it is, a post, rock, pit, mound, was destroyed, then they'd have something that they could reasonably bring that corner back and reestablish it as close to the original position as possible. So finishing the survey from the initial point, William Ives started at the base, or the initial point, and surveyed north till he hit Puget Sound in August 1851. And then he came back and he ran the baseline from the Willamette Stone going west to the Cascade Range when they got into the mountains, and he said, well, nobody cares about that, so he quit. And he went east and hit the Cascade Mountains, says nobody cared about that, so they quit. So they moved on, and so going south, James Freeman got to about as far as Canyonville, and the time was short, and the Indians were fighting in the Rogue Valley, so it wasn't until 1854 that they actually came down all the way to the California border. And plus, there was pressure from the Willamette Valley to process their surveys because of the settlers, and they couldn't claim their land until it was surveyed.
So yeah, he got to the Canyonville area about 1851 or around there.
Yes.
Saw what was ahead of him and said, yeah, no thanks.
I got
but
it.
Also,
And
also more business and money, therefore, was
easier surveying too.
Yeah, easier surveying. Very good.
And they were paid by the mile.
Yeah, very good. All right. Eventually went back in 1854 and got to the Rogue Valley.
Right, and this is an example of a map of 37-2 West, which incorporates Jacksonville, Central Point, and most of Medford. And the shaded areas are lands that were agricultural lands that were actively being farmed at that time. And it showed the roads, the train, and various elements of what goes on. And then with those areas that were already being used, we moved to the DLCs, which were mapped on a separate map. They couldn't be surveyed, and this allowed people to get title of their land.
Okay.
And so with all of this, then the commerce developed in the territory, the economy flourished, people settled, they built homes, they built the land, and they've used the land. And today we still go back to this system and use it, and use it to resolve conflicts.
Amazing. All right. Well, thank you very much for the history lesson. I am amazed that, some of the original notes are still referred to today, but certainly that they did a thorough job, and obviously something you can rely on. All right, Herb Farber, thank you very much for the history lesson, the history of surveying presented by Farber Surveying. Any last comments?
It's been a pleasure. I'm glad that I've had time to be able to do this for everyone, and hopefully it was of interest. I know that some people will be bored stiff, but others will be intrigued. But it's all history, and it's every day it's history.
Yeah, and the history of the Rogue Valley as well as things
Absolutely.
got down there. All right, well, thank you very much, and thank you for watching. I hope you certainly learned something this evening. That's going to do it. I'm Tom Resepke, and hope you have a good evening.